I'd like to welcome you to the second of our series on the impact of the coronavirus crisis on media communications, ICT more general. 2 weeks ago, we had a session about the media industries. Today, we have a session on the infrastructure itself. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and we also have a great set of audience, and to the extent that can serve also as a way for people to stay in touch and to meet and not to be only at home vegging out, but also working or isolated, but provide some community. Here we are. So the topic itself doesn't really need much introduction. We had an unprecedented lockdown of everything, but we also have experienced an unprecedented reliance on the infrastructure, ICT type activities, whether it's e-commerce or distance education or work from home or telemedicine or online video or governmental services or financial services. Everything has moved online, which is great, and it has worked. On the whole, I believe these speakers will confirm has worked reasonably well, or pretty well, or fantastically well. We'll see. On the other hand, it also raises the question of reliance and resiliency, and what if, in fact, some of these crises continue and demand continues, and it has jumped considerably. The system has been able to absorb, but not always. My personal experience at home here has been that most of the time it has worked well, but not all of the time. And if millions and billions of people have service problems, then that might be affected. Secondly, of course, there's also the regional and international issues. Some countries have a much inferior infrastructure, and therefore they might not have been able to scale up as well as some other countries or some other regions have been able to do so. And then there are different technologies, satellites, mobile wireless, wireline, etc. So to discuss these issues while they're still hot, while we're still kind of relying, like in this particular session where we communicate internationally, we have a great panel. I will ask them to stay relatively short because there are 6 of them. And I also want the audience to have an opportunity to not just ask questions, even better to make comments and observations, especially if they're different. So the first speaker is David Reddle, who goes by Reddle, who is the founder and CEO of Salt Point Strategies. He will tell us about it. Prior to that, he served as the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information, the head of the NTIA, which is the executive agency in the federal government. The FCC is not executive, for the federal government on these matters as administrator. He was also, before that, he was the Chief Counsel for Communications Technology at the U.S. House of Representatives and its Committee on Energy and Commerce. So he comes to this with a broad public sector experience, prior to that private sector experience and academic experience. So we're very happy, David, to give us the opening comments.
Well, thanks, Ellie. I really appreciate your having me on. This is an interesting time to be working in these policy spaces as we watch a lot of people say, wow, there's not a whole lot going on in my world. I don't think anybody that works on broadband policy or communications policy is currently finding themselves bored and sitting at home. So thanks for putting this together. As Ellie mentioned, my most recent experience was as at NTIA, and before that with House Energy and Commerce. So because I'm on with Lauren, and I never try to out-engineer Lauren, and with Joe and Jason, who I'm not going to try to out-corporate since they are in the space that are actually providing these services, I'm going to confine my remarks to looking at this from a consumer perspective, because I am one, and from a policymaker perspective. As a consumer, I have to say the experience has been pretty darn good. Now, admittedly, I am probably not your average consumer. I have symmetrical gigabit fiber at my house. I checked before we got on. I have 31 devices currently attached to my home network, most of which are active, and I average about 35 gigabytes of use per month. So let's just be fair and say I'm not your average user. But with being at home and running a business out of my house that is very reliant on video conferencing, and now having both an 8-year-old who is waist deep in distance learning and a wife who is a federal lobbyist for a pharmaceutical company, another industry that is not slowing down at all at the moment. Our networks have held up really well, both our in-home network and our connection to the internet writ large. And I think that's a real testament to those parts of this country that have had network competition, facilities-based competition. The reality for me is that if I want to choose between providers, I have lots of options here in beautiful Fairfax County, Virginia, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to get the system I've got going because of that. Ellie had posed a couple of questions to us ahead of time, and I think the one that struck home to me the most was whether or not we expect, demand to go back down. And to be honest with you, I don't. I don't think demand will ever go back fully to where it was to pre-COVID levels. I see from my perspective, living in a large urban area, that I think there are a lot of companies that are currently looking at this and re-examining their policies on telework. This has forced a lot of people to question whether or not they need a lot of commercial real estate space that they're paying for by the square foot for all of their employees. So while I don't think this certain peak that we're at right now, and certainly at least on the cable networks, I'm sure Jason will talk about, it looks like we've leveled off at a peak at the moment. I don't expect this to be the going forward baseline, but I certainly don't expect that it'll ever go back. And that's going to cause us to have to re-examine some of the things that we have held dear in terms of, as a policymaker, the long held beliefs and the certainties that we all thought we held. I think it's time to take a hard look at changing some of those. From my perspective, I think if you want to figure out how to take a look at this policy-wise, I think there are ways that we can embrace changes to public policy that will embrace this new reality. First of all, for decades, let's be honest, we've been fighting the same dogmatic word fighting in legislation for years. And a lot of that is based around trying to shoehorn broadband policy into an act that just is not equipped to deal with it. So if we are going back to first principles, let's first accept that the internet actually is special. It's not just a telephony network that we're shoving bits over. It is a communications technology that is special in and of itself. It's been free to evolve on its own, from text to the pervasive multimedia juggernaut that is delivering this entire conference to us today. And if we abandon some of the baggage of the old fights, I think we can probably move forward in a way that recognizes that we have to be able to provide this to people. Second, just as I would expect some policymakers who have tried very hard to use Title II as a way to regulate the internet, I would expect those who have said the internet is a luxury to give up that notion as well. Let's acknowledge that the internet is essential to 21st century citizenship. I don't care if you're an urban professional, a rural agrarian, a student, or retiree, no matter what phase of life you're in, it's hard to find a facet of American life that is not touched by the internet and fundamentally changed, particularly in these times, by the internet. And so those who lack access are at a distinct disadvantage and run the risk of being outside of the economic and societal changes that we're all facing at the moment. And when I say that, that means ensuring that we connect every American. And that's long been a very difficult concept to get all lawmakers to embrace. I think it's time to put aside the "that's expensive, it's a luxury" notion and say, this is something we have to do going forward. As we do that, I can't stress this enough, we need to build on the success of facilities-based competition. The parts of this country where we are seeing the best load balancing, the best ability to cope with the changes in traffic topography are the places where consumers have choices of networks. Faux competition by having mandatory wholesaling and letting people fight on price. I get that that feels good and drives good consumer happiness in the short term, but I think from what we've learned in this pandemic, that doesn't necessarily deliver long-term consumer benefit. And you can see that play out in the way American regulators have reacted to this pandemic and the way European regulators have reacted to this pandemic. Chairman Pai went forward and said, listen, throw open the data caps, don't charge for overages, don't cut people off. Those are business challenges, right? Those are asking people to take financial and business differences in the way they run themselves. By contrast, what you saw in Europe was the European regulators, under the guise of BEREC, came out and said, hey, Netflix, please turn yourself down to standard def of your own accord, and we're going to stand up this group of regulators who will step in if we need to help you guys run traffic on the internet. That's not a business challenge. That's trying to get into the operations of networks. And I think that's what we're seeing play out here, is that where you don't have the kind of competition, the kind of risk investment in networks that we've had here, you have regulators who are trying to get involved in running networks. And from my perspective, that's really problematic. We should be doubling down on having companies want to compete with each other to provide service to consumers. And the last thing I would add, because Ellie asked us to be short, is that as we look at this as policymakers going forward, we need to take a pro-investment strategy that looks at aligning incentives. We now can look straight up at the way things have happened in a very difficult situation and say what policies were in place in areas where consumers had it good, and what policies were in place in areas where they didn't have it as good, and learn some lessons and be willing to accept that maybe the things we thought about these two different things, whether it's closing the economic gap, the income-based gap for access, or closing the availability gap that's based on rural versus urban divide. Maybe some of the things we assumed just aren't true in the modern environment. And I think if we approach this with those principles and the humility to put aside our long-held beliefs and accept the data in front of us, this could be a real watershed moment for broadband in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David Reddle. Before I go to Lauren Wazer, Van Wazer, let me just kind of ask perhaps or make a comment that David can speak on later, but the speakers now can possibly too, which is, since you mentioned Title II, did the FCC's up and down, back and forth on net neutrality in its current incarnation, do we see that it made a difference, positive, negative, no difference at all? Can we compare it with other jurisdictions that do have different rules? What have we learned here by way of network management or other prioritization type applications? So Lauren Van Wazer, the Vice President of Global Public Policy for Akamai. Akamai is a $2.7 billion cloud computing cybersecurity services company, CDN. They are all over the world. They also issue some really nice statistical stuff on network loads that I've kind of seen a few days ago. So they have been doing really good stuff, and she can tell us also about the US and the world and traffic loads. Before being an Akamai, or in addition to being at Akamai, she is the past chair of the board of the Information Technology Industry Council, which is the largest global tech trade association. She's been everywhere, at the White House OSTP, at the OMB, at the FCC, at the AT&T, at Cox. And now she is speaking to us at Columbia. Lauren.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And I think it's very fitting after David is kind of talking about some of the big policy issues for me to discuss because Akamai is really on the front lines of some of these internet traffic increases and trends. But first, let me give you a little very short background on Akamai, because we operate behind the scenes and so many are not aware of our role. We touch between 15 and 30% of the internet's traffic all around the world. We operate in over 140 different countries. We're a leading provider of content delivery services and cybersecurity services. And effectively, we make the internet faster, more reliable, and more secure. We're business to business company, but you've used us for online banking, and buying anything online, watching online video, and doing gaming. So we're effectively a middleman on the internet. We work with internet service providers on behalf of content providers to get their content around the world. And we do this through a system of nearly 300,000 servers around the world, located in more than 1,500 networks. So we've got unique visibility into what's going on the internet. And so what does that mean in a COVID-19 environment with everything moving online? We've seen our traffic increase by 30% this past month. Typical monthly increases are in the neighborhood of 3%. And to boot, there were no big sporting events. You know, the US March Madness got canceled. The Champions League got canceled. So all of the major sporting events were canceled. And so there were no sort of traffic drivers from any of those types of events. In terms of unpacking that increase, because I think it would be helpful to know more than what the general trend is, the largest part of the increase is over the top video, but also gaming has been a very important part of the increase. Particularly saw an uptick in traffic in the last few weeks in March. And not surprisingly, when shelter-in-place orders are put in place, we've seen corresponding increases in internet traffic in places like Europe, India, and the United States. And we've also seen significant increases in social media, news and information traffic, not surprisingly. Another important part of looking at network traffic is really peak traffic. Peak internet traffic for us increased to 167 terabits per second in March, and it was less than half of that a year earlier for the same month. And not surprisingly, too, the periods of peak traffic are changing. Typically, we have peak hours, evening hours were 5 to 11. Now the peak hours are 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. With everybody trying to work from home. And really, the internet isn't being used only when people are asleep. And because there are different time zones around the world, that's a bit of a moving target, but it's not a lot of time, frankly, that the internet isn't being used. And weekend traffic patterns, which had been lighter, there's no such thing anymore as a weekend traffic pattern. And this change has been instantaneous. Internet service providers haven't necessarily been able to adjust their capacity, and it's not like a switch you're turning to the increase. And peak demand is the hardest to work around. So we've got consumers in all these different verticals I mentioned, and we carry entertainment type services like video streaming, gaming, but also critical online services so people can do online banking. And so the largest online service demand for bandwidth has been media. And you've seen around the world where some of the larger video streaming companies like Netflix and YouTube changed their streams from HD high definition to standard definition, and that's been true for our over-the-top video customers as well. And in the gaming vertical, we've worked with our gaming industry partners to develop best practices for gaming. I think a surprising factoid to many would be that one game download is the equivalent of 30,000 web pages. So there's been, not surprisingly, a lot of policy interest in developing best practices for gaming. So things like doing game downloads at off-peak hours. I would like to say, despite these incredible traffic increases, we haven't seen a degradation in performance for our services. So for example, according to our measurements, web download times have actually improved and are still improving over. So why is it so important to be working with industry to work on these issues? A bottleneck in the internet right now would be very problematic, or any kind of bottleneck. Everybody's getting all of their services online. And I guess I like to think about the challenge that we're facing, or users of the internet are facing, into three different buckets. We've got kind of revisiting past challenges. So in the gaming industry, there hadn't necessarily been a premium on being bandwidth efficient. That hadn't a defining factor. Now it is. We've got new challenges. The transition to the working from home environment is a new normal, and it raises a whole new set of issues from, is your corporate infrastructure set up for everyone trying to access the corporate systems through VPNs and things like that? So we've got a host of new challenges. And then we have a set of what I like to call next challenges. What happens next for businesses? We've seen a lot of new and innovative ways for doing business. Businesses that were offline have evolved to doing business online. And so the issue will be what sticks for the future and what doesn't. So for example, everybody's been doing online banking. When we go back to an environment where we can actually go into a bank branch, does that mean that since we've all learned how to do banking online, whether we return to that? And then I want to make a side note. I know we're talking about internet traffic and trends, but I want to make a side note on cybersecurity, because none of these online services work without sufficient cybersecurity. And that's an area that we really watch. And so the biggest problem is that the bad guys have been working from home for a long time. So unlike the rest of business, we're working from home. A disruptive is disruptive. There's no adjustment for the cybersecurity bad guys. So according to our figures, things like distributed denial of service attacks, those have not decreased. And in fact, more generally, we've seen a substantial increase in cybersecurity attacks. Maybe in part it's due to the bad guys knowing that IT managers are having to worry about how to transition the workforce to working from home. But now cybersecurity is just as important, even more so than before, and it's more difficult. It's harder to defend against. And there are new attack vectors. I'm sure some of the folks on this call have heard about the new phishing attacks, with luring your users to click on a link that provide about the COVID pandemic, and transmitting malware in the process. And so finally, I'd like to mention a couple of concluding points. I think we're at a really important point of inflection in how the internet is used that will have ramifications going forward for a long time to come. And I think this has been a tremendous accelerator for certain trends. So trends like video streaming, over-the-top video streaming, have been underway. I think now more and more people are relying on video streaming for their video content. Does that mean that there might be an increase in cord cutting and more of a reliance on streaming type services? Also in the banking arena, we've all done now online banking. Are we going to go back once this is over? So I think it's important to step back and think about what's going to happen after the pandemic ends, and how many of the trends are stickier than they were as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Let me move, since we are kind of want to stay on time here, let me move to our next speaker, Joseph Marks, the Assistant Vice President for Public Safety and Homeland Security for AT&T, who is responsible for federal policy and strategy planning on public safety, homeland security, cybersecurity, emergency preparedness. We have an emergency. Are we prepared? Have we been prepared? Joe has been with AT&T for a long time and has also dealt in inter-industry and intercompany and international type arrangements of emergency communications responses, 911, etc. So Joe, please go ahead.
Thank you, Eli. First of all, I'm delighted to participate in the webinar today and happy to provide some insight into the impact of the COVID-19 virus on AT&T's network. First, let me say we're living through unprecedented times. As I was preparing for the webinar, some 44 states had some form of stay-at-home, shelter-in-place orders governing our lives now. That represents over 95% of the population, somewhere around 306 million people. And add to that, 96% of the globe was living under various travel restrictions. This has led to a significant change in the way people are living, learning, working, and playing. According to a recent Gallup panel, nearly 62% of people say they're working from home, which has certainly created a shift in the certain traffic patterns on our network. We're no longer seeing peaks in wireless calling during the morning and evening commutes, and we're no longer seeing peak usage in urban cores either. As people work remotely, we're seeing a higher demand in video conferencing, as Lauren had mentioned, and voice calling as people no longer meet at the office. And with kids working at home during the day, we're seeing the effects of increased internet usage as various municipalities implement distance learning. And also, adults and children are using the online streaming services such as Netflix, Hulu, and YouTube more throughout the day as opposed to just the evening hours. As well, online gaming is booming during the shutdown. By way of recent example, 2 professional Spanish soccer players took to playing FIFA 20. That's an online soccer game. And a virtual audience surged to over 60,000 spectators watching them play, I guess attempting to replace our thirst for live sports. As the coronavirus has changed the way people work and connect with others, AT&T's been on the front lines of this shakeup. AT&T carries the most traffic in the US, and our networks have risen to this challenge. At the core of our network, our IP traffic has increased between 20 and 25% relative to pre-COVID-19 levels. That includes all parts of our business, business, home broadband, and wireless traffic. I think what's really come to a surprise to all of us is the new killer application, voice calling. Voice has become less and less. Suddenly it's in vogue again. And voice calling hasn't just been people picking up their phones to make phone calls, but overall spending more time on the phone. On AT&T Wireless's network, we've seen an increase between 20 to 35% of pre-pandemic levels. In addition, the residential voice calling has also increased significantly, up at least 51%, reflecting both a shift in business traffic, but also increases as family and friends are calling during this isolation. We're also seeing very elevated levels of Wi-Fi calling, where the volume has doubled from pre-COVID-19 days. Who knew that voice calling would be cool again? And while the text messaging has always been popular on AT&T's mobility network, we're seeing peaks jumping to over 23,000 texts per second. That compares with about 15,000 texts per second pre-virus. So what does all this traffic mean to AT&T's network? There's been a shift in traffic to the last mile, the wiring that connects homes via fiber and copper. But there have been no real issues in the way that we've architected our network, as it just works, even under these significant loads. For the wireless network, as I mentioned, there has definitely been shifts in traffic, but we're seeing unexpected help from the wired network connections. As mentioned, the urban core is getting less activity than in the past, and we've seen overall traffic increases in suburban and rural areas, but that's been partially offset by people using their broadband connections at home. So it really hasn't overloaded our network. For the most part, the core network traffic is able to respond to congestion by using alternate routes through the core network. We've seen artificial intelligence playing a really big role in helping to stabilize the network traffic if network congestion does occur. It's allowed AT&T to understand the changing traffic characteristics and balance that traffic load. AI, artificial intelligence, is also helping to remotely troubleshoot and diagnose problems on our network, proactively finding the root cause and helping identify the source of any congestion. In some cases, we have had to expand the capacity internally or manually reprogram routers initially to handle some of the voice traffic. But for the most part, we're over these humps and things are working smoothly. Goes along with what Lauren has said about kind of reaching a new normal. We're seeing traffic kind of smooth out over time. And all of this has been done without the need to cut back or ration capacity. I think I'm not alone in mentioning that in the US, we haven't had to cut back to our standard streaming services to standard definition. We've been supporting high definition and even ultra high definition in some cases without any glitches. In terms of public safety, AT&T's FirstNet network, which serves first responders, has also been very active during the pandemic. We've leaned very heavily on portable cell sites to augment capacity and provide special coverage for first responders. We have about 26 portable cell sites in operation right now, and we've deployed over 54 portable cell sites during the response to COVID-19. For example, we're providing communication services in support of the United States naval ship, the USNS Mercy, being used as a temporary floating hospital docked in Los Angeles. In a sporting venue in a parking lot in Dallas, being used as a pop-up COVID-19 testing center. And in New York City, the USS Comfort Floating Hospital, as well as supporting interoperability for hundreds of ambulances coming from outside the New York City region. AT&T has also changed the operation of our network during this pandemic, allowing many of our employees to work from home. This has represented a lot of challenges for some of the call center employees, since you couldn't have 200 people coming into a building and sitting shoulder to shoulder. So AT&T decided to get some of these 10,000 employees to work from home. But in most cases, we needed to get them equipment, laptops, computers, headsets, and be able to push remote software to their devices securely. On the commercial side, we've closed a significant number of AT&T stores, but we're keeping at least enough of them within a 20-mile radius to serve customers and first responders with critical communication needs. We've also limited the number of customers allowed in stores at the same time to facilitate social distancing. We've encouraged customers to use online resources where possible. And for the safety of our technicians, we're practicing social distancing like everyone else. And we've limited dispatches only when we've got a way to make sure that our technicians can keep their hands clean and equipment clean. Finally, I wanted to point out that AT&T's signatory of the Keep America Connected pledge at the FCC agrees, as David was pointing out, agrees not to terminate service and waiving any late fees for residential and small business customers because of their inability to pay because of the coronavirus. And we've extended that till June this year. And we've also agreed to open up our Wi-Fi hotspots to everyone to keep America more connected. So what are the expectations of this on our network post-crisis? Only time will tell. We do expect that there will be long-lasting changes to society. Perhaps more companies embrace the work from home policies, as Lauren suggested. Perhaps more schools embrace remote learning opportunities. In either case, we think the flexibility of our network leads us to believe that we'll be well positioned to handle these societal changes. Overall, COVID-19 has presented a lot of challenges to operating the largest network in the country, but we think our network has held up very nicely, certainly exceeding the expectations of many, but living up to the very high expectations that AT&T set for itself.
Well, are you done?
I'm done. Thank you.
All right.
Eli?
Well, okay. Thank you very much. Very informative. May I just kind of ask politely, are you making more money as people are using it more, or are you losing more money because expenses have risen?
So that's an interesting question. We are obviously challenged on AT&T is a multinational company and a lot of different parts now. You know, we're both an entertainment company as well as a communications company. And with all of the entertainment portions shut down, that's putting a lot of strain on us. And also some of the policies of agreeing to, not charge any overages and allow people to not pay during the coronavirus. That's also hurt some of our financials.
All right. Okay. We have now Dave Burstein, but before I introduce him, and of course, thank Joe very much for participating. I'd just like to recognize two things. One is this event is co-sponsored by CITI, that is Columbia, but also by the International Media Management Academic Association, IMA, which is the International Association of people such as professors in business schools, etc., who do teach and research management of media companies and of media. And we have from that membership a good number of people also participating in this event. Welcome from all over. Secondly, I'd like to recognize my co-conspirator in this. In fact, he has kind of came up with the idea and has done much of it, namely Jason Buckwitz. Jason would moderate this panel, except that he is also the chief technologist of this operation, and so therefore he is in the background kind of making sure that the electronic trains run on time. So thank you very much, Jason, for putting this panel together and for having the idea. So now, because we want to talk international, Dave Burstein has a great international perspective. He's the editor of 3 news publications, FastNet News, 5GW News, and GFast News. He is one of the best informed journalists in the business on telecom reporting. He's well informed, he's independent, he's knowledgeable, and he says it like he sees it. And he's also goes back to Columbia College, and we welcome him back.
Let me thank Ellie and say how flattered I am to be here. I've probably learned more in 20 years of going to CITI events than anywhere else, because he brings the people who are actually out there doing things. And that's happening here. When I listen to AT&T, and we're going to have Jason from Comcast soon, I confirm everything that I've observed around the world, that amazingly networks have done remarkably well. Some slowdowns, but there are virtually no examples in Europe or the United States of a slowdown or congestion that affected consumers. That's wonderful, and AT&T deserves credit for that. AT&T also deserves credit, as does Comcast, for stepping up for consumers here. And Chairman Pai deserves credit for putting that together, and he at least made it easier to get Lifeline. My politics on the left, pretty far away from David Riddle or Chairman Pai, but I can respect what they're doing, and they're doing a good job here. Elliot, let me ask the favor. Let me know when I have about a minute left, and I'll wrap up. You be the judge there. I can give answers to Ellie's last question from other places. Around the world, especially in Europe, where we have a lot of data, the revenues for telcos are about flat. Some of them are down about 5%. Roaming has disappeared. New phone sales have plummeted 50%, and so on. Profits are down some places, holding others. I don't know a major telephone company anywhere in the world who will not continue extremely profitable, for better or worse. So let me get going. First, let me point out that this is more serious than some people recognize. I'm talking to you 200 meters away from a tent hospital in Central Park. I've lost a friend. Everybody I know here in New York has lost friends. This is the worst in our lifetime, and we have to remember that. However, we in telecom have been very little affected. As I say, the networks are totally holding up. The 5G deployment worldwide is unchanged, and I say that after producing 100 pages of analysis reports. I'm more than a reporter these days. Analysts make better money. And I have a book coming on that. The US, like China, is actually increasing the 5G deployment from where it looked 4 months ago. That's great. Fiber is accelerating in the UK and Germany and holding its own in France, India, and Spain. Also great. Investment estimates from the telcos and their vendors are little changed around the world. And as I say, when I look at the actual network builds, they're holding up. Financial impact. A lot of that was Ellie's question, and I write for the industry, so I've been looking closely. Yes, revenues are down in some places, but revenues have been flat to down almost everywhere for years. The increase in total sales across Europe and the United States for the last few years has been less than inflation, and that was set to continue for the next few years by all the best estimates. Haven't seen much difference. The vendors are mostly on track. The key exception is Nokia, which has lost huge Chinese contracts, and they're going to fall to 10% or less of the market. The industry is worried about Nokia's future, although the stock is up because there's takeover talk. On the other hand, phone makers are getting clobbered, probably down 25% for this year. That's great for consumers. 5G phones are down to $285 for a decent phone from Xiaomi in China and $400 in Europe. The low phone prices are one of the reasons I think 5G subscriptions are going to keep up this year, and my estimates are higher than just about anybody else, and I'm confident of them. Okay, that's been said already. Policy. David Riddle and I are pretty much on opposite sides of the political pole. I'm on the left, he worked in the Trump administration. We have to work with the same facts, and I like to start with the facts. But first, let me give credit to David Riddle for recognizing something in 2009. He said that the $5 billion being spent on middle mile as part of the broadband stimulus wasn't going to work. He was absolutely right. $7 billion in the stimulus and $20 billion in other spending has done very little for the 5 or 10% of the population who don't have a great network coming into their door. Cable is in 96% of the United States, remember. So it's only 5 or 10% we're talking about with problems. That is about to happen again. I can almost guarantee that most of the billions that are being allocated will be wasted. Sorry about that, and I wish I could make a difference in it. However, I see something different about what is the smart policy to get things done. And I'm certainly not going to argue about Chinese versus US general politics. You all have an opinion on that already, but I can confirm that strong government action has been very effective in investment in telecom. Korea had a major push from the government to do 5G. They pulled ahead of everybody last year. They hit 4 million before anybody, even China did, and they have 90% of the country covered. That's a fairly democratic place. There were no orders given by the government, but they came in strongly. They are being replaced by remarkable results in China, which is doing 500,000 cells this year, look to have 150 million subscribers, and are 50% of 5G this year and next year, almost for sure. The Chinese government said accelerate, and in China, the telcos did exactly that. They don't shoot people who don't make their quotas, but they certainly do fire them. And the heads of the phone company almost always do what the governments tell them to. Very strong government power. That works. Number 3, however, is the US, where things are actually accelerating in 5G, although the fiber and everything else has gone slow. We have a government here strongly committed to deregulation, and Pai has been very active in what he's got done. Is that why we're doing well? Could be, but my take is very different. My experience, now 20 years in watching policy, is that nearly always investment is driven by competition and by technology changes. I see that the US the next year is going to be driven by technology. T-Mobile has a golden 160 megahertz of spectrum at 2.5 gigahertz. For business reasons, and because Pai insisted they commit to it in the merger, they are going to build rapidly, starting this summer. Verizon has to respond, because T-Mobile is going to have a better network in much of the country. And in fact, they've raised their capital spending by $1 billion. Still not where they were 3 years ago, but they went up because of the competition and the technological improvements. On the other hand, as far as I can see, eliminating net neutrality has had very little effect on anything, partly because the big guys are being very careful because they don't want to stir up trouble in Washington. Investment, people have been looking back and forth, arguing back and forth. I look closely, almost no effect, unlike things like competition and technology. On the other hand, I'm a net neutrality supporter, and people who agree with me said this would be almost the end of the free internet and destroy a whole lot of things. And it's 2 years later, and I haven't seen any change that affects consumers from Pai ending net neutrality. The left and the right both tend to exaggerate in policy, and everything I've seen for 20 years has been that policy, unless it's except where it's very strong, has very little impact. That may be because incentives don't work. They aren't strong enough to overcome the much greater incentives of technology, competition, and market opportunity. Last thing.
But really quickly.
I know a lot of people disagree with me. In my note to you on this before, I said opinion on this. Ellie, I can't hear you.
I said really quickly because we're running out of time.
Oh, you're telling really quicker to me. That's really simple. I was about to end and say, to my surprise, I thought you were going to say something really quickly with an interruption. To my surprise, the effect on networks and on telecom investment has been minimal, and it looks like that will continue. The hospital in Central Park is a good reminder that other things have to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. And we will kind of pick up on this perhaps at the end about the net neutrality, etc. Let me introduce to you now briefly Jason Livingood, who is the Vice President of Technology Policy and Standards at Comcast. Comcast needs no introduction, but for those of you who are foreign in other countries, it's the largest cable company in the US and maybe probably the world. It's also a major, one of the three major broadband providers in the United States. It is also involved in online video and has increasingly developed a technology dimension over recent years. And Jason is, in fact, the Vice President of Technology Policy and Standards there. He has done many techie things in a variety of ways at Comcast and elsewhere. He's involved in international and US network development, and we are very happy for you, Jason, to join us.
Great, great. Thanks so much. You can hear me okay, I assume?
We hear you fine, Jason.
So it's been interesting. You know, I feel fortunate and happy to work in internet engineering. You know, some of my friends who are in other lines of business have, you know, sort of had an extended vacation in a way. Whereas the past 8 weeks, I think for me and most of my colleagues have been completely bananas, would be the best way I can describe it, to the point that we're now really emphasizing to folks like, you know, try to pace yourself, don't burn out. You know, you can't work 7 days a week for, you know, too long before things fall apart. It's been really remarkable. And so I've got a bunch of interesting stats that I can share. You know, we just did our first quarter results this morning, and we added about 477,000 new customers in the first quarter. Of those, we had 32,000 new Internet Essentials customers. Now, basically what we did is our entry-level free or entry-level broadband product for folks, we increased that speed to 25 megs down, 3 up. And that 32,000 people adopting that new free service when it went free was March 13th. So that's about 2 weeks of growth. And so it's multiples of that, I'm sure now. And we've done free Wi-Fi as well. So a bunch of things similar to what AT&T mentioned. In terms of volumes, though, it's been fascinating. I think the numbers are very similar to what Akamai has seen. So we saw about a 1/3 increase in upstream consumption and about 13% increase in downstream. And a good way to think about the numbers as we look at them is that we saw a whole year of capacity usage or growth in 2 weeks that we would have seen in 52 weeks. So basically this massive pull forward of capacity, which has been really interesting. The traffic mix is still strongly asymmetric, but obviously there's been a lot of growth in upstream, which makes sense when you think about the apps that people are using in terms of video conferencing and VPNs and so on. Also pretty remarkably, the diurnal traffic patterns that we've been used to seeing for 20 years, you know, that I could sort of close my eyes and sketch out exactly what it looked like and tell you the hours, that has changed. So the peak times are occurring sooner and the peak times have broadened. The good part about that is that that has been growth from off-peak times. So in those cases, you're just having usage fill in where there was existing capacity already. But it's been really interesting to see that. In essence, you know, people are starting their days earlier and they're starting work And so you start to see big growth in traffic earlier in the day. Clearly, a bunch of the applications are driving that. Gaming up about 35%, 35% increase in streaming video. The real big standout is video conferencing and VoIP. That's up basically 300%, which is really fascinating. And to enable that or support that, not only does that application provider have to do it, but from an access network standpoint, you've got to increase the direct interconnections to those services so that they keep having the bandwidth all the way through to the end users. And from a mobile standpoint, while we don't operate our own mobile network as AT&T does, we have an MVNO. And for our MVNO customers, we've seen a 20% decline in LTE data usage because people are basically at home, they're not mobile, and a 40% increase in Wi-Fi. So not only matching that same decline, but increasing it as well. And certainly Wi-Fi in the home, that's been for us the two big things, the home network emerging as an interesting challenge for many users. So you have sort of much more Wi-Fi usage and concurrency of usage inside the house. I'll talk about that in a second. We've done a bunch to do some additional monitoring of customers. So right now we have a new gateway speed test that runs from our cable modem into the network to look at that access network portion and basically be an overlay or a check on some of our earlier stats. And we're running about 700,000 diagnostic tests a day just to sort of be a double check. So we've sort of turned up the dial on the monitoring. And related to that, I think I would say the numbers that we've seen are very similar to the numbers that the national trade groups have released in terms of speed and performance, and similar to those that say Ookla and SamKnows have released. The outlier is really the MLabs reports, and there's some different, I think Broadband Now and some others that have surfaced reports about this. And I think the caution there is you don't want to let bad measurement data or measurement methodologies drive bad policy decisions. So it's really important when you're looking at data to make sure you've got a strong data source and that you've got agreement maybe across multiple sources. And in cases where you've got one outlier like that, you should probably say, well, maybe there's a problem with that underlying system. In terms of capacity, the good news is going into this, we, like many ISPs in the US, maintain a lot of what I would call sort of excess capacity so that you can absorb these sudden peak hour events without having a major emergency, which is the design of the network. And so that has helped. We've grown into that capacity, but we've also been adding a lot more. So with a DOCSIS network, the main way you do that is through a node split, which basically means pushing fiber down closer to the home. So fewer homes pass, pushing that down in, as well as network interconnections to peering partners. So we've seen about a 50% increase in capacity augments on a national basis weekly. Some of the areas that have been especially busy have been 2 to 3 times, so 200 to 300%. And then we've done additional things in terms of adding additional DOCSIS channel bandwidth. And the one thing I think we feel really fortunate about is the advent of DOCSIS 3.1 a few years ago is seeing now pretty broad adoption in our network because that uses a new OFDM mechanism to sort of manage the bandwidth spectrum, and that's been a great efficiency gain for us. So it's been super helpful to have that. If I look at the problem areas, I think there would be two that I think are, one is fairly minor, and the other is I think the big one. The minor one is I think around gaming downloads. Lauren mentioned this, and I applaud Akamai's focus on best practices in this area, because the challenge you have, especially with things like Call of Duty game patches, is if you just sort of throw that out at peak hour, it just really kills a lot of IXP exchange points. We've seen some of those stats in Europe in particular. And so, it's important to distribute those in a way, off peak and sort of, at a lower bit rate per user, as Akamai and others have been doing. So that's been a good adaptation, I think. In terms of Wi-Fi, I think the two issues are not just the number of people using Wi-Fi, but sort of the available Wi-Fi spectrum and the other houses that are nearby sharing the same spectrum, but not necessarily the same network names. And so I think we've really seen, many of the issues that users have experienced go to the local network, whereas the access point, how many users are on 2.4 versus 5 gigahertz, and on and on. And so a lot of customers have invested in their home network, have done mesh Wi-Fi, done wired Ethernet for their desktops when they're doing a lot of video conferencing and so on. And there have been some good recent articles from the Washington Post and from Ars Technica explaining a little bit more about this, which are pretty good. For us, I think why did we adapt and handle this so well? I think good capacity management and investment were the key things. And we have just relentlessly focused the last couple of months on reliability and performance, and in particular reliability, just sort of minimizing change at this kind of time, which is important. I think in one of the discussion points you'd mentioned, why is Europe doing things like bitrate caps on some of the upstream providers? You mentioned Netflix, for example. I think obviously differences in the way that network investment is done there for those sort of virtual network operators that are different certainly from the US. But I would also say that we benefit by the design of the protocol. So, web streaming, I think it's debatable even in Europe whether those changes are really necessary, because by its nature, HTTP adaptive streaming is adaptive. It's adaptive bitrate. So when it sees conditions that approach congestion or that the connection's full, it will back off and rebuffer to a different bit rate. So those things I think are highly adaptive. In terms of spectrum requirements, I think the big thing that we see is just the need for a lot more Wi-Fi spectrum unlicensed in the home, just because there's such huge demand for it. Some of the winners, I think customers have added a lot of new equipment. As an example, we have 95% of our call center reps now working from home. So that means all of them had to be sent, equipment to be able to do that. And you're seeing that certainly with kids work, doing school from home, and other people working from home, just, lots more equipment being sold, certainly conferencing. But, in essence, or sort of, wrapping up, why did the network, which is really the good question to ask, why did the network handle this so very well? And I think you can go down, and I've talked to a bunch of the sort of early pioneers at the internet about this, Vint Cerf and David Clark and Scott Bradner and others. And I think one of those things is that the sort of distributed nature and sort of end-to-end design with intelligence at the edge rather than the core has allowed all these parties to independently act in a loosely coupled way without having to coordinate with some central company. And that has been hugely beneficial. And that's certainly an elegant protocol or an elegant design and architecture. But I think that only goes so far. It's only as good as its implementation and the ongoing investment in that network. And I think those are the two winners. We've had 20 years of folks like me and others that have spoken and on our respective companies, making sure that the network is engineered and operated and basically been implemented in a really good way. But also having that deep infrastructure investment has been just incredibly, incredibly important. And I think those are the key things that have caused this. But the network architecture itself certainly hasn't hurt in any way. So that's it for me.
Jason, thank you very much. All of you guys have been so interesting. I wanted to cut you off much sooner, but it was just too interesting to do so. So now our last speaker is Sharon Strover. Dr. Strover is the Philip G. Warner Regents Professor in Communications at the University of Texas. She was also the former chair of the Radio TV Film Department at that university. And she has done many things, but in particular, she is kind of knowledgeable on the state, national, and international level in rural communications, because we have now been talking a lot about the averages, national speeds, et cetera, and loads. But what about within a country, within the United States, for example? And so Sharon may address that issue and other issues, and also maybe hopefully the preceding speakers too, as a kind of cleanup type speaker at the end. Sharon, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Great, great. Well, I entirely agree. I think this has been an extremely interesting roster of speakers, and I don't believe I've ever seen Dave Burstein, but I've been reading him forever. So it's nice to actually see him here. My time is probably not best used by talking very much about demand. I think the people who've spoken have great statistics on the shifts the outward shifts that we in this country and other countries have made in terms of broadband use. And it's been very interesting to hear some of the details on shifts towards more gaming and of course the obvious shift in video conferencing now that many of us are working at home. I certainly would have liked to have heard more, and I would love to see more data on the population using mobile for internet access. When one looks at digital inclusion related issues, the statistics on people who rely on their mobile devices for internet access become pretty obvious. A lot of times for the folks who are entirely dependent on mobile devices for their internet access, data caps and other limitations, including plain old affordability, come into play. So some of the affordability issues have been at least temporarily ameliorated, but this question of how long they will last, because affordability issues fundamentally will not go away if the special plans that many of the companies that we've heard from here today, when and if they go back to normal and normal pricing, this figures into some of the topics that Rettel introduced as well, and that has to do with where there is solid fixed line infrastructure and where there is not. Obviously, there's less fixed line infrastructure in rural areas, creating not only availability questions, but those availability questions are compounded by affordability questions. In general, folks in rural areas are poorer, and the issue of being able to afford some of these plans comes up all the time when we visit and do our own research in rural areas. I know there's one statistic that jumped out at me back in 2014, a quarter of the housing units in urban areas had access to fiber, and that jumped up to 50% by 2014. In contrast, rural housing units, the statistic for 2014 was 10% having fiber access. By 2018, it was only 17.6%. In our own work, we find a lot of people who are smartphone dependent in rural areas, and also they rely on hotspots when they can get them. And I want to bring that up in a minute. Just to wrap up on service areas, there's been some very interesting work from Hernan Galperin with detailed analyses of Los Angeles, and Brian Whitaker with detailed analyses of Dallas that illustrate that in those particular cities, the infrastructure is far less robust in areas where there are poorer populations. That has got to be affecting their ability to work from home, if indeed those are the populations that are in fact working from home, which is another matter entirely. I wanna, since I don't have a whole lot of time, I want to talk about two things that I found quite remarkable. One is the rapid mobilization of nonprofits in response to COVID-19. There's a fairly robust organization called the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which very quickly became a lightning rod for people to share ideas around the country and to begin to brainstorm how to deal with COVID among the populations who don't have devices, who don't have plans, data plans, and who are struggling to cope. So the way in which they scaled up, I think, was with rapid networking, a lot of information sharing, and a lot of very detailed organizing in different geographic locations, supported by remote geographic locations, has been really quite striking. And that organization joined many others in petitioning Congress to extend phone and internet access legislation, saying the cost of broadband is so high and the broadband providers' policies are so discriminatory that even before the crisis began and millions lost their sources of income, more than 1/5 of households nationwide didn't have home internet, basically calling for a new policy response that COVID has really highlighted. There's a well-known ethnographer, she's now dead, who once said that infrastructure becomes visible when it's broken. And that's the moment that we're living in right now. The infrastructure that's broken refers to disease, of course. And there's nothing like this particular moment to make more visible how dependent we are on broadband services and internet connectivity. And it's been so long taken for granted, and it's been embedded in so many of our systems, which brings me to the second major domain that nobody has really talked about here.
Sharon, you have 2 more minutes.
Fine. That has to do with schools. And I think schools are really the big story, illuminating a lot of the ways in which infrastructure kind of breaks down schools and the problems that kids are having, both with lacking devices, lacking connectivity, and above all, perhaps, school systems lacking the wherewithal to manage these kids that are now, technically enrolled, but basically not showing up in so many cities and environments. We fundamentally have a compulsory public education system that's now dependent on a private commercial system in order to function, those private commercial systems providing internet. And we're at a point where there's a mismatch between the heavy dependence, even in non-COVID times, that the education system has basically quietly accumulated, and a private commodity internet service layer that is, it just doesn't match with the notion that we have a government system that makes education mandatory. So I think that calls for some fresh policy review here, and some new ways to kind of carve out schools, and I would add libraries to that as well, for not only connectivity and support within their own systems, but for extending what is considered a technology system to the homes of school children as well. I can end there.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I think we invite now, because we are kind of at the listed end of time, but we kind of going to run on for people to make comments. The audience, I would say, if you have questions, we'll take the answers at the end in a bunched form. But if you have any comments, let's get started. Jason, who has his hand up? Jason Buckwitz, that is.
Darcy has her hand up, Belly.
Okay, Darcy, please go ahead. Darcy, please go ahead.
Hi. Sharon, I really appreciated your talk and the research that you've been looking at. I'm up here in the Catskills in New York City, outside of New York City, and we have a situation where, after much ado for over many years, Spectrum did put cable down the road in this very lightly populated area. However, we are still experiencing, with wireline, problems at this time, particularly after 5 o'clock in the evenings, if we're trying to watch anything. So, and also we still have major issues with, for instance, a friend of mine who's trying to teach his college courses from Rutgers lives up on the top of some mountain and can, the hotspots aren't doing it. They're still using satellite, which is absolutely inadequate. And I absolutely agree with you. Something has to change with this.
Thank you very much. Other comments? Jason, who's next?
David Allen.
Steve.
David Allen.
David Allen. David, go ahead. I can see you.
Not unmuting. There we go. There, it's unmuted. Like Sharon, I was so pleased to have the chance to see Dave Burstein after all these years of appreciating his long work. I wanted to highlight his observations about net neutrality, budget pies, ending it here a couple of years ago. If I followed him correctly, what he said was that the big boys who might otherwise feel unleashed were being, quote, very careful. And of course, if that's true, it's because there is this invisible hand of, in this case, government, hovering over them, threatening them if they do bad things. Backing up from that observation a little bit, if indeed the forces that are at work in our society are on the one side competition and on the other side innovation, but we don't have any community spirit that's hopefully represented by government and decent government compared with what we have today, how can we expect going forward to have the kinds of outcomes that will reflect good community conclusions, particularly once the big boys say, oh, the government's not going to do anything about net neutrality, so here we go. Thanks. And let's say great thanks for this session. This is just terrific coming from CITI. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dave. Jason, who's next?
I've got a comment from Dwight in Canada. He wrote, question, connectivity has certainly taken on added significance, especially for rural, remote, and other underserved stakeholders. How have networks fared on the margins? And for those suffering under metered connections, what has been the experience of providers when they have temporarily suspended data caps?
Okay, we're going to hold that question for the panel, but I invite you to make comments. This do not have to be questions. All right.
The next person with their hand up is Heather Hudson.
Heather.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, and also it's great to hear from Dave Burstein again. A couple of comments. One is, after the earthquake in San Francisco in 1989, there was a significant blip in teleworking too, because the Bay Bridge was closed and some other roads and power and were out. And people thought, oh, teleworking has finally taken off. But it turned out that after we did a study that showed that, yes, there was a modest increase, but a lot of people just went back to what they did before. I think that we're on we're facing a more significant transition or inflection point, as I think it was Lauren who said that. But I'm wondering, it'll be very interesting to look at how these changes, once people can go back to work and back to school, what the ongoing impact will be, which I think will be significant, but not as much as we thought. The other is, I think it'll be very interesting to follow some of the ways that these technologies are being used to try to address the underlying problems of coronavirus, such as using AI and mobile phones to track where people might be, and using, as Google and Apple are proposing, and I think is starting in France, the use of Bluetooth to be kind of a way to do the tracking of contacts rather than only using humans to track them down. I'll stop at that point.
All right, thank you very much, Heather. The next hand up was a John, otherwise unidentified. John.
John Kerry.
John.
Okay.
Oh, John Kerry. Okay.
Right. What I want to, this panel's been fabulous. I want to point out the difference between this day and 9/11. On 9/11, the telephone traffic was overwhelmed. Many websites crashed. They had anticipated like Mother's Day, but not a crisis. And I hope someone will do a comparison between what's happening now and 9/11. That's it.
Thank you very much. But I do hope, John, that we do not have many data points. Additionally, we have Mike Einhorn and then Joe Plotkin.
Hi, David. I enjoyed your talks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, David. I enjoyed your comments tremendously. The community spirit is great. What projects, particularly in relation not to business, but in relation to government? Remember the interstate commerce, the interstate highway system. What projects do you think the government can get engaged in that would foster some kind of wider social good? And I will throw out one possibility being an interconnected healthcare system where doctors can refer more to each other's works on the internet, but also a consortial university system where students can attend different universities virtually and through hopefully WebEx be able to establish remote classrooms, but not just for one community college, but through a consortium, maybe even getting a couple of private colleges or state schools to buy into it. I wonder if the network has the capability of doing this now, or whether this is all a pipe dream because we don't have the money.
Very, very interesting suggestion, and I suspect that it's not the technology that will be in the way, but more the institutional jealousies and the revenue sources. In other words, the economics and the politics, not the technology. Now, we have Joe Plotkin.
Thanks, Ellie. Good to see everybody, or those I can see. I would just give a quick comment. So I work for Stealth Communications. We're a last mile fiber provider for businesses in New York City. Anecdotally, I will tell you that we're seeing a lot of businesses who have, besides the cloud, still have to connect back to the land from wherever their home office is, because a lot of stuff is still on the land, not in the cloud, which actually was a surprise for us. But my question to throw out generally is, do we see that there will be a greater appreciation now for symmetric connectivity with all the demands that we've seen and what everybody talked about? And now will there try and be a push on the residential side that it's not just a way to watch Netflix, that it's a participatory medium, and the upstream path, which has been underappreciated for so long, except in the business community, is now will be more highly valued, and maybe there'll be a push for more upstream bandwidth. I'd love to hear what people think about that. Good to see everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll respond to all people. Please, panel, remember what the questions or the comments were. John Peha. John?
Yeah, it was great to hear that, say, video conferencing like Zoom and WebEx are up considerably. I think AT&T said 300%. But I'm wondering how big a fraction of overall traffic, particularly of upstream traffic, it is now.
Good question. Okay, maybe AT&T or Akamai have the answer, or Comcast. Anybody else? I think we are out of speakers and out of time. So I would like to invite the panelists to make comments on the various things that they heard that they feel qualified to respond to. Why don't we start with, in the reverse order that we had you speak earlier, and we'll start with Sharon.
Yeah, well, One thing, and I didn't even get a chance to really highlight or respond to the excellent panelists who preceded me before, but one thing that really struck me was the reference of end-to-end that a few people made, and well, the networks performed well and apparently are very robust. End-to-end means wins both ends. You know, and I was reminded that one of the ends that one piece close to the end has to do with these hotspots that I never came back to, that are kind of implicated in the demand issues and the demand vulnerabilities that some of the questions refer to. Hotspots very quickly, hotspot orders went through the roof, and in fact, they to this day are not being, the demand is not being met. So I just want to highlight that end to end. Let's really take a careful look at the end, the user part of the end.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Jason, you're next.
Sure. So two quick comments. One, just continuing on the end-to-end in a slightly different fashion. One of the differences from 9/11 to today, one of the questions was about sort of website outages and so on back then. That was an era of deploying gear physically. And today, with the advent of elastic cloud computing and virtualization, the ability of a Zoom or a WebEx or Microsoft Teams to dynamically allocate thousands of virtual servers within seconds is a key to their success to handle that volume. In terms of upstream and symmetry, I do think, even though we've seen more upstream growth and certainly have for many years planned and continue to add a lot more upstream bandwidth, the traffic mix remains heavily asymmetrical. And I don't think we anticipate that really changing because of things like consuming web video and doing gaming downloads and that sort of thing.
Thank you very much, Jason. Dave, go ahead. Dave Burstein.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First, thank you those who said friendly things. If you don't know me, I'm always happy to talk and share data. Do ask very freely. I'm mostly a tech guy, but I care about policy, and I'll help anyone in policy, right or left wing, if I've got good data. A few things that I know. First, the only thing that's been proven to have much difference on getting people connected is price, for better or worse. All the education and so on has had very little impact. How you make that happen is a political question. You have as many ideas as I do. Second, how to get more people connected. I is doing some of this. You look for the very few people, fewer than 10% and probably fewer than 5%, don't have a decent connection available to them. So you have to look at those 5% or so and say, what can you do to affect them? Unfortunately, most of them are rural, where there's only one or two providers realistically, and nobody can come in because there's such a high fixed cost of deploying into rural areas. So that means technical neutrality and even auctions are highly limited in what they can do. And you should look for what's going to work. For example, about 3% of cable, last I looked, did not have cable modems available, presumably needing a digital upgrade, and some small systems haven't done it. That would be one of the very cheapest way to offer 100 megabits to a whole lot of people. Related to that is that the technology is now clear that low orbiting satellites can reduce the latency problem that's the difficulty with existing satellites. How widely they'll be used, whether they'll make money, we don't know yet. But clearly they can deliver a reasonable latency service. Relevance of that is, I would say, and Walter Jenkins at the FCC was the first who suggested it to me, that where it's prohibitively expensive to serve people on the ground, say $10,000 and more, which has been spent on broadband, those definitely should be aimed at satellites. That was the unofficial opinion in the broadband plan back in 2010. Nobody was allowed to say it for political reasons. The older satellites do have a latency problem. You can live with it, but it's annoying. But it is a problem. The new satellites solve that. We should reach the last 1% with satellite, 2 and 5% with the smartest way we can do it. Thanks.
David, Dave, thank you very much. If I move on to the next panelist, I hope you will forgive me. Joe Marks, please go ahead.
Thanks, Eli. There was a lot of really good questions that came up. I'm not sure we have a lot of time to address all of them, but certainly I think the one about the certainly on the mobility side, the mobility hotspots, I think that caught a lot of people off guard in terms of the need for as many as there were. I can tell you that internally we had received a lot of requests and responded to a lot of requests for mobility hotspots, and we also worked at trying to figure out alternatives to make more available when this problem showed up. So it's surprising some of the things that show up in terms of emergencies like this and how you respond. So I'll give time back to other respondents. Thank you, Eli.
Thank you very much, Joe. Lauren, please go ahead.
Sure. I guess I just wanted to comment on the comparison in terms of 9/11 and now. And I worked at the FCC during Hurricane Katrina, which I put as another milestone in these types of events, very similar. You know, we've had a 20-year march of increased reliance on internet service and increased internet penetration. In 9/11, CDNs really were brand new. The idea was brand new, and at the time of 9/11, Akamai was reeling. You know, we lost our co-founder was the first victim of 9/11, and a very important date in our company's history. But at the same time, we were doing all sorts of emergency integrations for websites, media websites that hadn't used CDNs. So 9/11 was really a proving time for the CDN set of technology. And now it's an integral part of the ecosystem. I think some of the same problems, and I keep using Hurricane Katrina, frankly, as my point of comparison, exist before that exists now. And so, for example, ensuring that the proper personnel get access to facilities to augment capacity and things like that. That, you know, there's at the time we had Hurricane Katrina, there was talk of federal credentialing, you know, would be helpful. And we have to deal with this issue around the world. There's been no Europe-wide action on access to facilities. We've been okay, but it's been very much, you know, having to call local authorities and, you know, country-specific authorities. So I guess I would say I'm happily we're in a different place. I think the infrastructure really has advanced, but we still have some of the same policy challenges.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. And David Riddle, last.
So I'll be brief and in some ways a little bit curt, and I apologize for that. Dave Burstein, warms my heart to hear you say I was right about something. Troubles me you had to go back 11 years to find something you think I was right about. Darcy, I hear you. The Catskills are tough. My family's in Dutchess County. They're having the same problems for what it's worth. And that leads me to the sort of 2 points I wanted to make at the end of this, which is I hope we can see this as a time to pivot and focus on what matters. And that means, one, let's stop conflating adoption with availability and tackle those challenges separately. They're different challenges. They're going to require different solutions. And the sooner we stop lumping them all together, the sooner we can dump some of the baggage that comes when we try to do them at the same time. And last, please, oh please, for the love of God, can we be done with net neutrality? It doesn't matter what regime it was under. Nothing has changed. It's still the boogeyman. Corporations still fear their customers. And in some cases, the FCC, didn't matter whether it was under Title II or not. It has never been a problem. It's not now. Let's move past that and get to the point where we can talk about making sure we don't have Americans falling behind in their connectivity, rather than thinking about what motives companies might have to do X, Y, or Z.
Well, thank you very much. Let me conclude here with several words. One of them is Dave Riddle's predecessor, in fact, the first one as the administrator, as assistant secretary of NTIA, was Henry Geller. Henry Geller, in his 90s, passed earlier this month. And those of us who had the privilege of working with him or hearing him are kind of feel a real sense of loss. He contributed a lot, so in that sense, everybody in this sector benefited from his earlier work, and he was a giant. And my second acknowledgement is to my co-conspirator Jason Buckwitz, who has been quite in the background, but without him, this thing would not have happened. And thirdly, I would say, in conclusion, perhaps, one of the things that we heard here is that things went really well so far, knock wood. And just imagine the same thing happening 20 years earlier, without the internet, without broadband, without the ability of easy e-commerce, Netflix and other services for entertainment, e-commerce, telemedicine, distance education, work from home, and all these things. We would go crazy, right? So in that sense, we have given, rightly so, a lot of tribute to the people in the medical front lines and the public service front lines who have put their lives on the line in order to help the rest of us. We also should acknowledge here the people in this infrastructure, telecom, cable, satellites, broadband, ISPs, what have you, who have been there and made it possible for us to function. And in that sense, they have saved employment, they have saved sanity, and yes, they have saved lives. And so we should tip our hat and recognize what they've done for us. So, and for the speakers, of course, you have summarized what has happened and what will happen and what has not happened. We are very grateful to us. You were really a star-studded team. Thank you very much. 2 weeks from now, we will have our next event at noontime, which will be about the financing and financial transaction following an investment behavior and investment implications of the COVID crisis in this sector. And thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you, Eli.
What, no wine and cheese afterwards? Why already?
The wine was